MKUltra, the ultimate American conspiracy. A government-funded cadre of mad scientists bent on using drugs, sex, and torture to control human minds. This top-secret program has become infamous for its experiments on the human psyche. Despite the many layers of protection and obfuscation it was afforded during its running, MKUltra is now nearly a household name. Some might argue that it's a stain on America's legacy, if the USA didn't already have quite an extensive history of ignoring human rights whenever it was most convenient. Given that you're here, watching our channel, I'm betting that you've at least heard of MKUltra. But do you actually know what went on during this so-called research program? Do you know how it turned some good, honest, upstanding scientists into monsters? Let's take a deep dive into this awful experiment in psychological warfare. And fair warning, somehow it's way worse than you probably thought. Even its origins are pretty horrific. This video was sponsored by Nebula. Before MKUltra was a twinkle in the CIA's eye, its foundation was laid through Operation Paperclip, a program that grew out of the end of World War II as the US and the USSR raced toward the Cold War. Initially, the ultimate goal of intelligence officers was to find and capture biological and chemical war agents, both to prevent their use against America and its allies, and to add them to their own arsenal. But they quickly realized that their efforts would be better served by instead recruiting the Nazi doctors, physicists, and chemists behind the science. Why would you steal fish from a fisherman if you could just pay the fisherman's salary to have infinite fish? It was called Operation Paperclip because as German scientists were arrested by Allied forces, intelligence officers would review the personnel files of the prisoners and they would place paperclips on the folders of the scientists they wanted to target. Through Operation Paperclip, over 1,600 scientists and engineers, many of them Nazis, were taken from Germany to the United States and given jobs with the US government. US intelligence leaders felt that the opportunity to leverage the German expertise into new technologies for America outweighed the ethical issues around rewarding war criminals with jobs and cover stories. Now, this is especially horrific when you consider the fact that much of the biomedical research and the biological and chemical weapons that were so coveted by the US during this time were developed and tested on prisoners in concentration camps. Some of the scientists recruited via Operation Paperclip had been directly involved in studies of brainwashing and torture in Germany. Some of them had just been prosecuted as war criminals in the Nuremberg trials. As the world descended into the Cold War, the US government became terrified the Soviet Union and other enemies of America were developing new techniques and drugs that could allow them to control minds. They were deeply paranoid that, using said techniques, the Russians might be able to manipulate an American agent into giving up government secrets, or even implant an unwitting double agent into the agency. Now, to be clear, this fear was not based on any strong evidence that this was actually happening. The Cold War was just that scary. In an effort to fight back, over the next decade, the CIA developed several secret projects focused on developing techniques for mind control and behavior modification, with a special interest in developing things like truth serums and interrogation techniques that could draw information out of even the most unwilling detainee. The first project, called Project Chatter, was launched in 1947, and it was focused on testing drugs that could better enable interrogation. Psychedelic substances, in particular, were explored for their potential as truth inducers, including mescaline, a psychoactive alkaloid derived from a cactus that has effects similar to those of LSD and is believed to act by binding to serotonin receptors in the brain. It is also thought that the first US government-sanctioned experiments with LSD may have happened under Project Chatter. A few years after that program began, the CIA launched Project Bluebird, later called Project Artichoke. The primary goal of this project sounds like something out of a movie. And in fact, you may recognize it from the 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate.
But I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word.
The question this project wanted to answer was, using special interrogation techniques, including drugs, hypnosis, and isolation, could a subject be forced to make an assassination attempt involuntarily?
They can make me do anything, Ben.
Based on heavily redacted documents that have since been released, it seems that intelligence agents had a very specific use case in mind. Here is a quote from a CIA memo from 1954 that I think really displays how bananas this plan sounds, at least to our modern ears.
Access to the subject would be extremely limited, probably limited to a single social meeting. Because the subject is a heavy drinker, it was proposed that the individual could be surreptitiously drugged through the medium of an alcoholic cocktail at a social party, Artichoke applied, and the subject induced to perform the act of attempted assassination at some later date. All the above was to be accomplished at one involuntary, uncontrolled social meeting. After the act of attempted assassination was performed, it was assumed that the subject would be taken into custody by the redacted government and thereby disposed of. Whether the proposed act of attempted assassination was carried out or not by the subject was of no great significance in relation to the overall project.
The CIA conducted experiments on subjects, many of whom were prisoners, both within the US and overseas, using hypnosis, isolation, and a wide variety of drugs. Some of these tests were even done on unsuspecting CIA agents. There are claims that some agents were dosed repeatedly with LSD without their knowledge, including one agent who was given LSD for 77 consecutive days. Some of these tests were done overseas, often on prisoners in American stations in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. In one of the stations in West Germany, US forces had taken over a former Nazi transit camp, called it Camp King, and converted it for detention and interrogation. Some of the prisoners who were kept here were ex-Nazis. Some were captured Soviet agents. And some may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, claiming to be refugees but judged unreliable by intelligence officials. Nearby, a stately home called Via Schuster was converted to a black site, where especially suspect, or expendable, prisoners were sent to undergo experimental interrogation techniques. CIA officers recruited the former Surgeon General of the Nazi Army, General Walter Schreiber, to become the staff doctor who advised the Project Bluebird teams in how to conduct these special interrogations, which involved combinations of hypnosis, electroshock, heat exposure, and various psychoactive drugs in an attempt to break and reveal the secrets of those being tortured before they were killed and their bodies discarded. It's really challenging to view these experiments as anything other than sadistic torture. CIA memos from the early 1950s indicate that they were attempting to answer a number of what they considered to be important questions, seeking to understand how to get accurate information out of unwilling detainees, how to condition their own agents so they would never under any circumstances spill state secrets, and how to hide drugs and poison in everyday items like candy and cigarettes. It seems obvious to me that extreme torture would never be a good option for getting accurate or complex information out of a prisoner, and that it would be impossible to guarantee that an agent would never spill a secret. Maybe I simply have a 21st century perspective, which includes a much more extensive awareness of the realities of human psychology and biology. And so I'm able to say, that's obvious. Maybe in the 1950s, as scientists were just beginning to unlock psychedelic drugs, all of these realities actually seemed possible. But even so, the government knew these experiments were horrific. They went to great lengths to cover up and hide the work, both while it was happening and well afterward. Ultimately, Project Artichoke was abandoned because intelligence officials realized the likelihood of being able to induce complete mind control in a single subject after a single social interaction was, let's just say, extremely unlikely. But that didn't stop them from continuing to pursue many of these questions using many other approaches. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles issued the order to begin MKUltra. Supposedly, the project was launched in response to the use of mind control techniques on American prisoners of war by the Soviets, Chinese, and North Korea. MKUltra was intended to be an extension of the work that had already been done up to that point, with the ultimate goal of, you guessed it, being able to control the human mind. The program's leader was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist, who was described as being a relatively soft-spoken man who lived a very simple personal life and came from a modest background, which was in contrast to most of his colleagues at the CIA. Gottlieb was driven by a deep desire to serve his country, but due to a physical disability, he was not able to serve in the military. So instead, he pursued a government career where he got a position with the Department of Agriculture and then moved through the FDA and the National Research Council before he landed himself a position with the CIA. That was thanks to his expertise in poisons. Gottlieb was hired on the recommendation of his former mentor, Ira Baldwin, who had just been hired to lead a massive US biowarfare program geared at developing and testing potential chemical and biological agents for war, including anthrax. In fact, some of those lovely Nazi doctors brought over through Operation Paperclip contributed their knowledge to that anthrax research. Baldwin vouched for Gottlieb's chemistry expertise, which landed him the job. Gottlieb had been involved in Project Bluebird and then in Project Artichoke. He and CIA Director Dulles shared a conviction that there existed some combination of chemicals and interrogation techniques that could allow them to fully dominate the human mind. Because of this common belief, Dulles basically gave Gottlieb carte blanche to do as he liked, which is what ultimately led to MKUltra, with Gottlieb overseeing the program. Now, at the start, Gottlieb dabbled in a variety of substances that might make a suitable truth serum, including cannabis, cocaine, and heroin, and he ultimately landed on LSD. Gottlieb tried the drug himself, and after his own experience, believed that it merited much more testing as a potential interrogation and control tool. Under his guidance, LSD experiments expanded rapidly. At that time, LSD was still almost brand new. Its effects were only discovered 10 years earlier, in 1943, by a scientist named Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories in Switzerland. He was isolating compounds from ergot in search of a new cardiovascular drug. Now, ergot is a fungus that grows on rye plants, and it was known to have vasoconstrictive effects on blood vessels. And it was also known to cause delirium and hallucinations. In fact, some historians believe that ergot poisoning may have contributed to the hysteria that led to the Salem witch trials. Weird to think that they may have all just been tripping balls. In the early 1950s, LSD was starting to spread in certain circles, but was not yet well known, nor was it illegal. Sidney Gottlieb believed so strongly in the power of LSD, and he was so concerned about the possibility of it falling into the hands of the enemies of freedom, that he purchased the entire supply of LSD from Sandoz for $240,000, which is almost $2.8 million in today's money, to ensure that all of the existing LSD in the world was under US control. This amounted to 10 grams of LSD. Now, on paper, that doesn't sound like very much. It's not as simple as a straight conversion, but as an example, 10 grams of sugar would be about 2 teaspoons. But LSD is a very, very potent drug. A typical dose is between 50 and 150 micrograms, and a microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. So 10 grams of LSD would be about 200,000 doses. Gottlieb then turned around and asked an American pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly, to figure out how to make more LSD to ensure an exclusive, extensive supply for years to come. At the head of MKUltra, with 6% of the total CIA budget and basically no oversight, Gottlieb got to work on a multitude of projects. According to a document from 1955, here is a non-comprehensive list of the kinds of substances that MKUltra was working to discover and experiment with.
Number 1. Substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. Number 2. Substances which increase the efficiency of mentation and perception. Number 3. Materials which will prevent or counteract the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Number 4. Materials which will promote the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Number 5. Materials which will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way so that they may be used for malingering. Number 6. Materials which will render the induction of hypnosis easier or otherwise enhance its usefulness. Number 7, substances which will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture, and coercion during interrogation and so-called, quote, brainwashing. Number 8, materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Number 9, physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Number 10, substances which produce physical disablement, such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. Number 11, substances which will produce, quote, pure euphoria with no subsequent letdown. Number 12, substances which alter personality structure in such a way that the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced. Number 13, a material which will cause mental confusion of such a type that the individual under its influence will find it difficult to maintain a fabrication under questioning. Number 14, substances which will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts. Number 15, substances which promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. Number 16, a knockout pill which can surreptitiously be administered in drinks, food, cigarettes, as an aerosol, etc., which will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agent types on an ad hoc basis. Number 17, a material which can be surreptitiously administered by the above routes and which, in very small amounts, will make it impossible for a man to perform any physical activity whatsoever.
As I said before, Gottlieb believed deeply in the potential of LSD. Many of his studies involved LSD either on its own or in combination with other drugs or coercion techniques. Honestly, figuring out how to talk about all of the banana cake experiments Gottlieb oversaw has been really challenging. Like, where do I even start? It's a horrible choose-your-own-adventure. Should I begin with the experiments he did on his own employees? Or the experiments he oversaw on prisoners and addicts in US mental hospitals? Or should I start with the fact that he even directed experiments on children? Or maybe I should just go straight into how he used sex workers to surreptitiously dose random people with LSD. Well, we gotta start somewhere, so let's start with how Gottlieb liked to dose unsuspecting CIA agents with LSD without their knowledge or their consent. Gottlieb had a keen fascination with the potential for LSD to temporarily alter the behavior of government officials, and he actively sought out techniques to reversibly incapacitate people or cause them to act radically out of character in the hope of manipulating specific events and interactions. And Gottlieb explored ways to covertly administer the drugs. In his initial LSD experiments, he used volunteers, either his CIA colleagues or scientists who were working alongside the CIA developing new biochemical weapons. Volunteers would take specified doses under the observation of their colleagues. Some people gave permission to be dosed without warning, to allow the other agents to observe the effects of LSD if the subject was unaware that they were taking the drug. But eventually, the possibility of being dosed with LSD just became an occupational hazard of being a CIA agent. In some cases, it was fine, particularly in those who volunteered. People had trips, they were observed by their colleagues, and they went back to work the next day. But in some cases, people's lives were destroyed. One agent who was dosed with LSD ran across Washington, D.C., claiming to see monsters in the cars passing him. A deputy United States Marshal named Wayne Ritchie sued the U.S. government in 2006, alleging that he had been dosed with LSD mixed in his alcoholic beverage without his consent, which resulted in paranoid thought patterns that led him to rob a bar at gunpoint. He was forced to resign from his job afterward. Perhaps the most well-known and the most horrifying case is that of Frank Olson, a chemist who, like Gottlieb, trained under Ira Baldwin and ended up working as part of the US's biochemical warfare program. Over time, Olson found his work, which involved studying the effects of poisons and other chemicals on living creatures, to be very emotionally taxing, and he began to feel disconnected from it. But he was also a major liability for the government. Olson was working on top-secret projects in biowarfare, and he was also quite familiar with the special interrogation work that happened in Germany as part of Project Artichoke. In 1953, at a retreat for MKUltra team members, Olson was dosed with LSD. By the next morning, he was withdrawn and paranoid, and he told his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." In follow-up conversations with his supervisor, Olson expressed feeling all mixed up and indicated a desire to quit his job. Olson was shipped to New York City to meet with a medical doctor with CIA ties for psychiatric treatment. Less than 2 weeks after the LSD experience, while in New York, Olson plummeted to his death from the window of his hotel room. The police report at the time called it a suicide, and Olson's family was told that he fell or jumped from the window after a nervous breakdown. There have since been many claims that Olson, as a major liability who was not processing his LSD experience well, was murdered before he could break free and put the government's biowarfare and interrogation work at risk. There are even claims that the reason Olson was dosed with LSD in the first place was because intelligence agents were trying to figure out what he knew to determine if he needed to be disposed of. Reading stuff like this, it sounds completely absurd, like the wildest conspiracy theory. But Frank Olson really existed. He really participated in experiments that involved gassing animals to death. He really observed his colleagues torturing people to death. And he really was dosed with LSD without his consent less than 2 weeks before his mysterious death. When I learn about this sort of thing, I start to understand, just a little bit, why people can believe all the different conspiracy theories about the government. Things like Area 51, or faking the moon landing, or that 9/11 was an inside job, or the garbage that QAnon spouts. If the US government can actually commit these kinds of acts and get away with them for years, is it that hard to believe that there might be political candidates running sex trafficking rings out of pizza parlors, or that wildfires are being started by Jewish space lasers? Okay, that last one is still hard to get my head around, but even the best possible interpretation of what happened to Frank Olson is that while he was already struggling with anxiety and depression around his job, he was dosed with LSD without his consent during a work retreat, and his mental health declined so severely afterward that he jumped out of a window. That's horrific. And honestly, from what I've read, it really doesn't seem at all far-fetched that he may have been killed to prevent him from spilling what he knew. While we may never fully know the truth of what happened to Frank Olson, one thing I do fully know to be true is that this situation was up. But the LSD dosing went beyond CIA agents. As the MKUltra program grew, and once Eli Lilly cracked the formula for LSD, Gottlieb realized that if he wanted to conduct all of the experiments that he wanted to conduct, he couldn't simply rely on his small clandestine team, especially not now that he had a large, steady supply of the drug. Gottlieb wanted to conduct large-scale controlled studies on human subjects, and he needed the facilities, medical professionals, and volunteers to do it. But MKUltra was top secret. Gottlieb couldn't just go around handing doctors his business card and a bunch of LSD. So the CIA set up multiple shell companies to funnel the money into the right hands, usually in the form of philanthropic foundations like the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research and the Josiah P. Macy Foundation. When these fake organizations announced their interest in sponsoring studies of LSD, a whole new world of research arose, as many interested scientists and clinicians jumped onto the funding bandwagon. Some of these funded studies were totally chill, even attractive. Apparently, in many clinics, doctors, nurses, and staff who observed the results of LSD trials on student volunteers were so impressed that they began to sign up to participate in the research themselves. But many of the experiments were less savory. In some cases, people struggling with addictions were coerced into participating in the studies by being promised they would receive a dose of whatever drug they were hooked on, or they were told that the drugs they were being given were essential to their treatment. Gottlieb's own personal foundation, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, conducted studies that involved recruiting Chinese refugees into the research with the promise of a fellowship, when the actual aim was to secretly reprogram them to commit acts of sabotage once they returned to China. They also explored other techniques to break down the human mind. One researcher the CIA funded believed that he could repattern the human brain and reshape the minds of his patients. This researcher, Donald Ewan Cameron, directed the Allen Memorial Institute, which was a psychiatric hospital affiliated with McGill University. Now, I wish that I could say that Dr. Cameron was a good person who was manipulated by the aspirations of MKUltra, but it really seems like he was just kind of a bad dude. Using that CIA funding, he funneled many of his patients, who were mostly normal people who suffered from mostly run-of-the-mill mental illness like anxiety and depression, into his research without their consent. His so-called treatment techniques included extreme sensory isolation, prolonged drug-induced semi-comatose states spanning weeks to months, and delivering electroconvulsive shock therapy at many times the normal strength. Patients would eventually receive the psychic driving procedure, in which they were moved into a solitary ward, given LSD, and strapped into earphones that would play repeated phrases for days on end. Of course, while Cameron reported that he could de-pattern the minds of these patients, he was never able to actually re-pattern anyone successfully. So he basically just tortured a bunch of people for nothing. When it came to the more extreme experiments, the MKUltra studies favored expendable subjects. This often meant prisoners and patients in mental asylums, like those used by Cameron in his work. In one such study, a group of African American patients struggling with addiction were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. In another, 14 children between the ages of 6 and 11 were given LSD every day for 6 weeks. These kids were supposedly schizophrenic, which immediately throws up a big red flag for me. Schizophrenia symptoms don't usually develop until people reach their late teens or early 20s, and diagnosed schizophrenia before the age of 13 is super rare. When I read about that study, I had to pause. Who were these kids? Why were they in the hands of these scientists? And what happened to them after the study? What happened to all of the people who were coerced into these experiments? In my research, the subjects are just a footnote. The stories focus on the characters who committed the acts, not the ones who were tortured. But for me, it's really hard to read about these studies and not think about the ways in which the work reflects what the Nazis did during the Holocaust, and how blatantly most of this work violates the Nuremberg Code, whose first statement begins with the sentence, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." And all of this was for what? I mean, spoiler alert, MKUltra was never successful in completely controlling the human mind. They never created a sleeper assassin, not even close. They never managed to create total amnesia, and none of their techniques, as far as we know, were better at getting information out of someone than any of the ones that had been used before. So what was the point? Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. I haven't even talked about Operation Midnight Climax, which is possibly the wildest, weirdest, and least legitimate sounding thing that MKUltra paid for. And given what I just described, I think that's saying a lot. In MKUltra Subproject 42, Gottlieb tasked George Hunter White, a district supervisor of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Office, to oversee a safe house in San Francisco. In this particular project, Gottlieb wanted to see how combining sex with psychedelic drugs could influence individual behavior and, possibly, make people susceptible to coercion. White hired a group of prostitutes to bring unsuspecting clients to the pad and give them LSD while he watched and recorded the results via surveillance equipment and a one-way mirror. White, who was himself quite a character, kept the bar well stocked and used to sit watching the activities next door while drinking an entire pitcher of martinis. Now, in some ways, the approach kind of makes sense. People are often vulnerable after sex and likely to make small talk with their partner. A sex worker who has been taught what to ask could pretty easily turn that conversation toward topics that might interest the US government, especially if that conversation was lubricated by substances that impaired the John's judgment. And the substance use wasn't limited to just the experiments. Apparently, White and his men were well known for indulging in the substances and the sex themselves. And according to one of White's men, Gottlieb was an effing nut who also took advantage of the women White hired to staff the pad. Pretty different from the soft-spoken character he was often described as. Gottlieb used White's resources to test other things as well, like an extremely thin needle that could be used to inject a poison into a bottle of wine through the cork, or a gas canister that could quickly dose a room full of people with LSD. The safe house, along with a similar one in New York, was closed down after about a decade. I kept looking for more information on the motivations behind Operation Midnight Climax, and to be honest, it kind of seemed like that was it. Just a way to see if a combination of drugs and sex could be used to get men to spill their secrets, with some fun recreational use on the side for the CIA agents involved, and some fun new spy gadgets to test out. It sort of sounds like something a person on acid would come up with, which kind of makes sense because Gottlieb apparently often told friends he'd taken LSD over 200 times. When you hear about Operation Midnight Climax, it's like something out of a James Bond movie. Yet another story about how it was a different time with different values that are unacceptable by modern standards. It's wild to realize just how much of the US government's money went into funding this project, and all the others. All the money that was poured into trying to control minds, and they found nothing much. LSD was eventually determined to be too unpredictable and insufficient for providing enough control for the CIA's purposes. They did explore alternatives, but none of the work in those arenas even held a candle to all of the experiments and tests done with LSD. On paper, MKUltra ended in 1963, when a member of the CIA Inspector General's staff discovered that the project was dosing subjects without their informed consent. Despite attempts to justify the work, the Inspector General shut it down, insisting that any research follow appropriate ethical guidelines. Supposedly, on his own retirement, Gottlieb indicated that he did not believe his work had been effective. The thing I can't stop thinking about in all of this is, some of these men seem to have otherwise been good people. Like, yeah, some of the people involved in this work were perverts and sadists. I'm looking specifically at the guy who gave LSD to literal children. There's no way you can completely explain away all of these choices as patriotism. But by all accounts, Sidney Gottlieb was a loving husband and father who enjoyed a simple life in the countryside with his family when he wasn't designing poisons for assassination attempts or directing the torture of inmates. Most of the CIA agents involved in this project probably weren't evil people, but were likely driven by the belief that their work would contribute to a greater cause beyond themselves. Something that kept coming up in my reading was this idea of serving the country, national security, and all that. MKUltra was born because of a fear the US's enemies had already cracked the mind control code. Or if they hadn't cracked it yet, they were sure to do it soon, and America had to get there before them. It's so hard for me to understand that mindset. I don't know if it's simply the product of living here, now, looking back on a world that was so different. A world where there were only 3 TV stations, where the first atomic bombs had just been dropped on human cities and killed hundreds of thousands of people, where we had just uncovered the atrocities committed by Germany in the concentration camps, and where we feared that the Soviets might rain bombs down on us from space. I grew up on the internet. I've had friends all around the world for most of my life. It's impossible for me to grasp the nationalism that seems to have been so pervasive during that time. I can't relate to this idea of needing to serve my country. My personal identity has very little to do with the fact that I happen to have been born in the United States. I don't think our national values or policies are superior to anyone else's. And in fact, I think we're very far behind much of the world in several key areas. So the idea of protecting American values doesn't resonate with me at all. So while reading about MKUltra and all the people involved, I keep wondering what the people behind it were really like. Was Gottlieb really a good dude who was just deeply motivated by his belief that what he was doing was going to protect his country? Did he and his colleagues really see the people they were torturing as being so far removed from them as to not be human, or even seeing them as monsters, and therefore deserving of pain and death? Or did his humble, soft-spoken manner conceal an evil inside of him? Was Gottlieb himself a monster and a sadist who took pleasure in hurting other people, and who had no qualms about indulging in the drugs, sex, and parties that were available through his line of work? Most likely, I think, he was somewhere in the middle. Gottlieb was human and therefore fallible. Gottlieb was both Jekyll and Hyde. He probably loved his family, and when offered the opportunity to do LSD and sleep with sex workers, he said yes. He probably did believe that his work was important for national security, and at times, he probably also genuinely enjoyed the things he was doing to other people. Ultimately, we'll likely never really know what drove him or the others working on MKUltra. In 1972, when Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms refused to help cover up the White House's role in Watergate, Nixon fired him. As he was saying his goodbyes to Gottlieb, the two agreed that they should destroy all evidence of the now mostly defunct MKUltra project. Only around 20,000 documents, which had been misfiled in another location, survived the destruction, and those files were the basis of the Senate investigation of MKUltra in 1977. Most of the recovered papers were financial documents detailing the expenses and purchases made for MKUltra projects. Little was given in the way of motivation or planning, but a lot was revealed about where the money went and what it bought. MKUltra was first revealed to the public in 1975, when reports from the Church Commission and the Rockefeller Commission unearthed the fact that the CIA, along with the Department of Defense, had dosed human subjects with psychedelic drugs without their consent. Following the revelation of the program, President Gerald Ford signed an executive order on intelligence actions, the first of its kind, to explicitly prohibit conducting such experiments without the informed consent of the subjects. The reports and investigations also led to public awareness of the fact that Frank Olson had been dosed with LSD a few days before his death, which led the Olson family to file a lawsuit against the US government for their role in his death and covering up its circumstances. When questioned, Gottlieb claimed that he couldn't remember much of his work on MKUltra. He did his best to avoid talking about the work and stay out of the limelight. Gottlieb left government work, and he tried to live a simple, rustic life. His wife later reported that he became something of a hippie, lighting incense, meditating on pillows, and wearing Birkenstocks every day. He got a master's degree and became a licensed speech pathologist in 1980, and Gottlieb never spoke of his work at the CIA. But despite his desire for separation, the past followed him. For the remainder of his life, Sidney Gottlieb became entangled in mounting lawsuits for essentially drugging and torturing participants as part of MKUltra, including Frank Olson. The attention he received for orchestrating MKUltra led his children to stop speaking to him for a time. He reportedly became depressed, and he was never the same man he once was. Some people actually think that he spent the last years before his death in 1999 trying to atone for what he had done. What stands out to me here is that ultimately, there was a pretty huge lack of repercussions. While the investigations did lead to codified rules around human experimentation, it doesn't really seem like any of the people involved in creating or running MKUltra, which clearly ruined the lives of many people and likely led to the deaths of many more, were ever held accountable for the damage their work did. Gottlieb was the main force behind MKUltra. When he died, so too did most of the program's secrets. In fact, some people suspect that Gottlieb may have died by suicide, essentially sacrificing himself to protect the CIA and his colleagues. In some ways, it's not really surprising that beyond a few out-of-court settlements, little came out of the MKUltra investigations. Powerful people protect their friends. And because of Gottlieb and Helm's foresight in destroying the records, there really wasn't much hard evidence to support all of the claims of what MKUltra did. Once again, it becomes obvious why conspiracy theories can so easily take root. If this is the sort of project that our government can run for decades in the name of national security, what else might they be hiding? Honestly, there are so many more things I could talk about related to MKUltra. All kinds of fascinating tidbits and names start to come up when you start looking into this stuff. As an example, it turns out that infamous gangster Whitey Bulger was among the prisoners who were subjected to repeated high doses of LSD. Another example, MKUltra sent a CIA operative to Mexico alongside Gordon Wasson, the man responsible for making the United States aware of the magic mushroom. And because Gottlieb and the CIA controlled almost all of the LSD in the world, people like Allen Ginsberg and Robert Hunter, of Grateful Dead fame, were first exposed to LSD thanks to MKUltra's funding of psychedelic research at universities and hospitals. Seriously, the list goes on for ages, but I've got to cut myself off at some point. I'd really like to make another video about how the CIA unintentionally created hippie culture, but given what we've experienced with our other content about psychedelics, I'm sure it would be quickly demonetized. In fact, I think there's a pretty strong chance that this video will be demonetized. And for independent creators, it's hard to put in all the time, energy, and resources to create videos like this, only to get punished for it. So, I want to give a huge thank you to the folks who watch our videos on Nebula, who make it possible for us to dig into topics like this one. Nebula is our streaming service, where with our other amazing creator friends, we've built a space where creators like us don't have to worry about getting demonetized or feeding the algorithm. And instead, we can focus on creating detailed, high-quality, original content that can't be found anywhere else. In fact, it's a great place to go if you want to learn more about the CIA's clandestine work. You can check out the work of creators like Half as Interesting and Joe Scott to get into how the CIA, with Sidney Gottlieb's help, tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, or how they may have created dreams that could kill. Or you could check out some of our Nebula exclusive content, like the video I did about how baby brains are sort of like adult brains on drugs, or Micah's video reacting to therapy TikToks. And there's tons of other exceptional creators producing groundbreaking videos you can only find on Nebula, including originals by Lindsay Ellis, Real Life Lore's Modern Conflict series, Abigail Thorne's play The Prince, and so many more. But it's more than just getting access to extended and exclusive content, or getting Nebula classes where you can even learn from other creators about their specialties, or getting to see my videos ad-free before they go up on YouTube. Supporting Nebula means supporting us, and lets us focus on making the best, most interesting videos we can. And right now is a great time to check it out. If you sign up using my link at nebula.tv/neurotransmissions, or use the link in the description below, you can support me directly and get Nebula for 40% off the annual plan, which comes out to just a little bit more than $250 a month. But if you're like me and you hate those monthly subscription fees, Nebula is also offering lifetime memberships for $300. I'm a big believer in the buy once, cry once mantra, and this lifetime membership is exactly that. You pay one time, you get access to Nebula and its growing catalog forever, and you never have to worry about it ever again. So please check it out, and thanks for your support. So what do you think? Was it all justified in the name of national security? Were the scientists all monsters, or just normal people doing their patriotic duty? Or somewhere in between? And here's an ethical question for you. Do you think that sometimes, in the name of science, it's necessary to conduct research without the fully informed consent of the research subjects? Let me know in the comments below. And if there's other facts or information that didn't get included in the video about MKUltra that you want to share, blast it down there too. Thanks for watching this episode of Neurotransmissions. Until our next transmission, I'm Ali Astrocyte. Over and out.